Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to Blackboard Biology. So today we're going to wrap up our ecology series here with our final video on population ecology. So far we have covered all manner of different things within ecosystems and ecology and things just in general worldwide, but also we've kind of broken it down into ecosystems, and today I want to look specifically at the idea here of populations. Now, why would this be important? Well, sometimes things get too broad, they get much too large for us to track across an entire ecosystem or especially across an entire biome. So sometimes we might be interested in what we call population demographics. Okay, so demographics or demography has to do with different data, things that we can track about populations, such as population size. All right, so here's some examples. Population size, population distribution. Okay, and so distribution is where do we find them? Where are they actually distributed in the world? So this is like geographic locations. We are also interested in population density. So how many of these organisms do we find in a particular area? So it's population numbers versus area. So how much, do we have 5 per square meter? Do we find, 5 per square kilometer? What's the density? So these are all factors that we would look at when we're worried about or concerned with studying population ecology or population demographics. So one of the things that is of particular importance, especially if we're talking about conservation of species, we would be looking at population growth. If you were to have a species that was listed as endangered or a species that was, potentially going to become endangered, we would want to look at population growth. And there's 2 main types of population growth that we see in organisms. And they can be quite different, but they do have some similarities. And the first type is what is known as exponential growth. Now, you may have seen a curve like this from math class if you've had algebra, especially if you've had algebra 2. And this is an exponential curve. It starts out and it just increasingly goes up. All right. This population growth is not all that common with species in the wild. It's more common with things that you would see like bacteria, these little single-celled organisms, because they require fewer resources as a population, so there's more available. So let me give you an example. If you've ever played the mobile game 2048, you're familiar. You slide these tiles together and they would start out as ones, and if you slide 2 ones together, obviously you're going to make a 2. Well, then when you continue to slide these together, if you slide 2 2s together, it becomes 4, right? And so what it's doing is it's doubling, and that actually models exponential growth. There are some bacteria species that can reproduce every 20 minutes. So if you started with 1 bacterium, after 1 cycle, 20 minutes, it would be 2. After another 20 minutes, those 2 would be split into 4. After another 20 minutes, those 4 would be split into 8. And it would just continue to go on and on. And this is exponential growth. It picks up speed as it goes. And it just increases and increases at an even faster rate. Exponential growth. This curve, it is truly a curve. It is not a steady state of growth. It's increasingly growing faster. Now again, this is bacteria. Eventually, though, even bacteria would reach what we call a carrying capacity. Now, what is this idea of a carrying capacity? Well, carrying capacity is exactly what it sounds like. It is full capacity, the largest population size for this particular species that the environment can support. Now, you may be wondering, what kind of factors are going to affect that? Well, there's lots that affects that. So if we're trying to figure out what affects population size, let's list a few things. Some things, obviously resources such as food, okay, or I could even say energy, because some things, are photosynthetic. So we'll say energy / food. Space, things need space. They need oxygen. oxygen may become limited in a particular environment, such as when we get runoff from crops, fertilizers and things that make their way into streams and ponds, lakes, rivers, and they can cause overgrowth of algae and other aquatic plants in there, and that actually reduces the dissolved oxygen. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, photosynthetic organisms, they're going to produce oxygen as a byproduct. They do, but they also have to use oxygen to break down glucose through the process of cellular respiration. So you actually end up with a very large oxygen deficit in those waters. So oxygen is a major limiting factor. Sunlight could be a limiting factor. Clean water could be a limiting factor. All of these things can limit how large a population can grow. And so what we call this logistic growth. If you've ever seen the UPS commercials, they talk about logistics. What can logistics do for you? Well, logistics have to do with, again, all of these factors and coordinating things and allowing things to get done in a timely manner and with efficiency. And so logistics here is going to limit the population size. So if you follow this curve, it can grow, but then look right here. It starts to level off, and eventually it will reach a carrying capacity where it cannot, if it exceeds that, it will be disastrous for that population and potentially for the entire ecosystem, because there are more organisms than there are resources. Now, what you're going to find, though, is that all these things are going to contribute to a stable population, but it doesn't just continue on in a straight line forever. Okay, when it reaches a certain point, it doesn't just continue on at this straight line. What's going to happen is you're going to see changes in the population size year to year, and so it's going to maintain this kind of dynamic equilibrium. So it levels off, and it's going to continue to change. And it may dip a little bit or go up a little bit, depending on what disturbances occur. But it's this idea of dynamic, meaning it does change. It's not the same year after year. It fluctuates some, but it does maintain equilibrium for the most part. It's fairly stable. Okay? Now, this idea of population growth, again, exponential over here versus logistic growth over here. This is the one that we see more often. This is more common because exponential growth requires limitless resources, which is just not a very realistic thing. So we actually can observe this with human populations. And in fact, many demographers, people who study population demographics, have done so. And here, let me show you an example of kind of one of the main theories here, this idea of the demographic transition model, that nations or even the world, if you want to look at it on a global scale, have undergone these stages of demographic transition that have affected population size throughout the decades and millennia. So let's take a look here. Stage one would be pre-modern. Okay, so pre-modern world, so that we're talking, thousands of years ago. And what we would see here are, in the red is the death rate. In the blue is the birth rate. And so if we look at the red line and the blue line, up here in this section, they're pretty close to each other. And as a result, if we look down here, the total population remains fairly steady, because the birth rate and the death rate are pretty even. So there's as many people being born as are dying in any given year, close to the same. But look how high they are. Look how high these are. These are up in the 30s per every 1,000. That means for every 1,000-something children born, 30-something of them will die before the age of 1. And the death rate for every 1,000-something people, 30-something are dying every year. So the birth rate and the death rate are very similar, and so we don't see any population growth. Well, then we enter into what is known as stage 2, which typically coincides with urbanizing and industrializing. So what would happen here, we bring in, it becomes more industrialized. This is a developing nation, a developing country. There are more job opportunities. With urbanization and industrialization often come more education opportunities, access to improved sanitation, access to improved health care. And so what we begin to see here is the death rate, the red line again, the death rate goes down. But if you look, the birth rate stays high, which leads to population growth. You have more being born than you have dying because, again, we have access to improved sanitation, all kinds of things. So let's list a few of these factors over here. So in the industrializing stage, we would see improved sanitation, greater access to clean water. We would see more education opportunities. Particularly as you see education opportunities for women, that will become important here in stage 3 in just a moment. Education opportunities, better health care. So all around, just so many factors that we consider that, well, here in America we take for granted, but things that we consider to be very beneficial to life, right? These improve the overall quality of life, all right? And so all of these things contribute to quality of life, and as the quality of life goes up, typically lifespan does as well. You're less likely to die of, cholera or typhoid or these other typically preventable diseases if your quality of life has gone up and you have, clean water, and if you have education and you have access to medicine and health care. So let me clear some of these things off here. Now, what happens is eventually, though, populations can't grow forever. And as we begin what they call this mature industrial stage, stage 3, if you'll notice, the birth rate starts to dip and decline. Now, why would the birth rate decline? Well, again, access to higher education, especially for women, typically you're going to see a shift in values. If a woman knows that she can go work, that she can help provide financially for her family as well as her husband, then you are going to see them have a shift where they're going to say, I probably don't need to have as many children. I want a career, or I want to be able to work outside the home a little bit too. And so it's a change in values. As we see improved sanitation, water, education, healthcare, all of these things, parents begin to realize, this especially occurs in rural areas of the world, parents begin to realize I don't have to have 8, 9, 10 kids just to improve my odds that a few of them are going to survive and take care of me in my old age. They're going to say, okay, there comes a point when they realize, all right, all 4 of my children that I've had are going to survive into adulthood typically, and typically they'll have access to education, they'll have opportunities. I'm going to be taken care of in my old age by fewer children. I don't have to have as many until you reach a point where, in North America, for example, the U.S. or Canada, the average, fertility rate for most women is you can't, obviously, you're not going to talk about 1.8 children, but typically it's the average number. If you take a mathematical average, is just under 2 children per average woman in America and in Canada. And so the fertility rate goes down because, again, it's kind of a shift in values, a shift in focus in life. Over here, in stage 1, we're just trying to get by. We're just trying to survive. Birth rates are high, but so are death rates. Here, things are getting a little bit better, but again, the values, our habits, our traditions as a particular nation or culture haven't changed that much. In stage 3, though, we see this shift. And so the birth rate goes down until eventually you may hit a point where the birth rate and the death rate are, again, about equal, but they're low. They're low, and so your population, this black line here ought to look familiar from just a moment ago. Exponential, but logistic growth, to where we reach kind of this carrying capacity that's kind of imposed by national values, by the market, the national market, the national economy, what can we afford, what can we do, and then sometimes even space. As you look at, maybe some European countries, there's just not a lot of land. There's just not a lot of extra space available, and so people just tend not to have as many children. They're more comfortable. They have a higher quality of life. They have a pretty long lifespan, and so they just don't have as many children. Again, the focus is a bit different. And so one of the ways that people, and I'm going to wrap up this video quickly here, one of the ways that people try to track things like this for different nations is through an age distribution. These are age structure diagrams, and the shape, again, any diagram, any graph that we're going to look at, the shape is going to be important. And so the shape of these age distributions, notice here the blue, ages 0 to 14. So these are kind of what we would consider pre-reproductive. Now, obviously, there's a little, wiggle room there as you approach age 14 for humans. Some of them become sexually mature around 14 or even before. But generally speaking, it's around, we're going to start considering age 15 to 44 as reproductive age. Again, definitely prime reproductive years for humans. So anyways, you always find outliers, but so this is the blue is pre-reproductive, the yellow would be considered reproductive, and then this would be the 45 to 85 plus would be post-reproductive. And so that's how they divide these up. So let's look at some of these and see kind of if there's any patterns we notice here. For a country that is having rapid population growth, okay, so their population is rapidly increasing. Let's look at some of these. So Kenya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, these tend to be developing nations. And so we see this rapid growth because, again, death rate is declining, but birth rate is still high. And so because the birth rate is high, you have lots and lots of young people who then reach reproductive maturity and continue the high fertility rate that the previous generations had. So you end up with a rapid growth. So for rapid growth, where it's a really wide pyramid at the bottom, and we end up with rapid growth. But what happens if the fertility rate begins to go down some? Well, you end up with this kind of look here, where you get slow growth. Notice it's still larger at the bottom, but there's not as big a disparity as there was over here. So things are a little bit more even, and what this means is that the death rate has decreased, but so is the fertility rate. It is slowing down as well, and so you're going to see slow growth. So think very industrialized, kind of Western society nations where you've got, again, Western values, slow birth rate, very slow death rate. So think United States, Australia, Canada. That's slow growth. Now, what about European countries? Many of these European countries actually have zero growth. And so what we would see with these is, look at this, it's very almost straight up and down tower more than pyramid. So again, this would be where your birth rate and your death rate are now basically even. So there's no growth. As many people as die in that country a year, there's that many people born. Things are very even. We don't get population growth. We're not losing population. It's just zero growth. Well, can you have negative? Well, apparently so. Let's look at these countries over here on the right. Notice the shape here, wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, or more narrow at the bottom. That's kind of odd. What is happening here is people are just not having children. There are not enough children being born to replace those who are dying. And so you actually end up with negative growth in the population. The population size decreases because you're losing more people than you are gaining. Deaths over births. And so, again, that's not a super common thing, but again, think European countries where that is happening. So if you're looking at third world countries, they're going to be over here. Third world, right, are going to be these are third world countries, right, very poor, or possibly in the process of developing. If you think of, and then these others over here are going to be first world countries. So that is population age distribution. Again, it's a useful It's a useful demographic to look at because, again, it's reflective of the stage that a nation is in that whole demographic transition model. And again, we're looking at things like education and access to clean water, access to improved sanitation, access to healthcare. All of those things are going to affect this. And in terms of global population and in terms of population in nations like China, this is very important. These are very important things to study and know because they are rapidly running out of space, running out of resources. And when you have an overabundance of people, you've overshot your carrying capacity for your nation or for your area. You end up with lots and lots of poverty, which, as we know, leads to higher crime rates, higher death rates, higher drug abuse, higher alcohol abuse, all manner of things. Poverty is linked to all those things. And so if you overshoot your resources, you overshoot your carrying capacity, the quality of life goes down. And so I hope that this video has been helpful to you in beginning to understand population ecology. And again, this wraps up kind of our ecology series for the time being for a high school biology course. And so as always, I want to thank you for tuning into Blackboard Biology. I encourage you to like, subscribe, comment on the videos. I'll try to get back to you. Have a great day.